Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. If you are here this week watching us on video, you will see I am not in my normal home studio. I am in Montreal covering the Liberal convention. But I took a break. I took a break from the Liberals just for you because I have a great interview lined up. Today, I am talking to Margaret McCuaig-Johnston. She is a long-time China hand who has been briefing the Canadian government on various issues on China's tech and human rights policy for a number of years. She was recently in the news because she was kind of attacked at a parliamentary committee where she was testifying on EVs. Look, we get into it. We talk about history. We talk about her history. We talk about that committee meeting. We talk about Michael Ma. We talk about the risks that Chinese EVs pose to Canadian security and economy. She is no holds barred with us here, and I am so grateful that she took about an hour of her time out to get into all of this with me, Jen Gerson, your host, On the Line. Well, we have with us today Margaret McCuaig-Johnston. Thank you so much for having or taking some time to chat with me today on the Line, Margaret.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's been a very long time since you and I have had the opportunity to chat. For our people who may not be aware, Margaret was in the news over the last few weeks because she has testified at multiple parliamentary committees on Chinese EVs. This blew up when newly anointed Liberal MP Michael Ma gave you some hell at a committee. Do we just want to quickly, briefly explain what happened? I know we're going to get into it at the end of this conversation, but do we just want to chat very quickly what happened so that people who weren't necessarily following the news will know?
Well, he, I think, was seeing me as a critic of the government's policy on Chinese EVs, so he was trying to undermine my credibility, calling into question my expertise, and tried to say, in particular, have you ever seen forced labor, which is part of the aluminum in Chinese EVs is made with Uyghur forced labor? And have you ever seen forced labor with your own eyes? Or do you just believe hearsay? And I paused. I looked around the committee table and I was saying to myself, is he joking? But then it turned out he wanted an actual answer to that question. And so I said, no, but Human Rights Watch has documented this thoroughly. And so then he went on to the pro-China witness who was sitting next to me, who was a lecturer from Montreal.
Okay, we're going to get into that and why it's important, but to explain why I think it's important, first I think we need to roll back the clock a little bit for our audience and explain, are you a China expert? Why are you a China expert?
Well, I've loved China for many years, and I have a master's of international relations focused on China. My first visit was in 1979. I wanted to see the Xidan Democracy Wall, which is a democracy movement of that time. And I went there and talked to the students and workers. And then through my years, 37 years in government, I was primarily focused on science and technology policy and programs and funding. And because I spoke Mandarin, I had learned some Mandarin, I was often the person who was asked to host delegations when they came from China as they were trying to develop their capacity for research and development, or lead industry or science delegations to China and speak at conferences, their major international conferences. And so when I retired from government, I thought I would write about China's science and technology system. And I've been at the University of Ottawa since the end of 2012, when I retired, and researched a lot on China's technology system, and started seeing a lot of problems that Canada would have if we partnered with them on different kinds of technology. And so I started briefing in to the Canadian government, to my former colleagues. I was an assistant deputy minister in technology for 13 years and started raising big red flags, so to speak, about things that I was seeing. And then when they kidnapped the Michaels, having been a vice president of the Canada-China Friendship Society, I said to myself, I've got to be the kind of person who speaks out against kidnapping innocent Canadians. They'll pay more attention to me, who they know well. I've been to the Chinese embassy many times for meetings and events. And so I started speaking out about that, and then started speaking out about other problems I was seeing from a technology lens in China. Things like the role of Huawei in 5G. So I became a real opponent of getting Huawei for 5G, and I was really glad that we didn't do that. And I started looking at the surveillance technologies they were using against the Uyghurs to track them, track all of their movements, and looking at the really prisons that they built just for the indoctrination of the Uyghurs. And so that drew me more into human rights. I've been a member of the Canada Committee of Human Rights Watch since 2012 as well. So I've come at it mostly from a technology angle, but my personal interest from way back in 1979 was democracy and human rights.
So I think we need to just put this into a bigger picture here for a second, because I think that there were a number of people, pan-partisan, liberal and conservative, who had a lot of ambitions and a lot of hopes that as China began to liberalize economically, that this would absolutely inevitably lead to more liberal political policies, and that, if the West partnered with China and worked with them hand in hand, over time, maybe it wouldn't be a grand revolution, but maybe over time we would see more rights for Chinese citizens. We would see a less repressive or authoritarian approach, and we would see more human rights become the norm in China. For you, I mean, I take it that was your optimistic path. Can you tell me what turned you against that approach?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, so many of us who had focused, academically or in their career on China, certainly a lot of leaders in the U.S. on China issues, felt that slowly it would become, if not democratic, at least a more open society. And really, the leadership of China for many years was focused on that. But Xi Jinping came in at the end of 2012, and he changed the approach entirely. And he said, now China has to stand up. We have to be a world leader. And he started giving very new directives to the Chinese diplomacy ranks to take a much stronger role in international organizations. Talked to scientists and engineers about getting into the lead in international organizations, having Chinese leadership in those organizations. And we saw that happening actually pretty quickly once he gave that directive. One of my biggest concerns was the new role that he gave to the integration of military and civilian technology development. And that had been kind of a latent policy in the background in China for many years. But in 2013, he took the helm. He became chair of the National Commission for Military Civilian Development. And what it means for Canadians who are partnering with the Chinese in a civilian university is that they need to be aware that that civilian scientist is required, if asked, to help the Chinese military with their innovations. And it's really driving a lot of new innovation in the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the People's Liberation Army Navy. And so, that's a real risk for us. They started developing under ice technologies for use in the Arctic. They had a policy from 2015 to 2020 to map the seabed of the Arctic, which would include Canada's Northwest Passage, and also undertake a major study of the security of the Arctic. So, they were doing this all from the platform of science and technology and trying to get onto Canada's science research ship and see what that looked like, trying to get into our science research center in the Arctic. And, I was really concerned about that because, we don't want the Chinese surreptitiously learning how to get through the Northwest Passage because we need to know who's there at any time. And so that's, I think, a real vulnerability. So those were some of the other things I was raising as red flags for Canadian officials.
And what was the response when you raised those flags? Were those concerns taken seriously?
Yeah, they were, I think, most taken seriously by CSIS. And I've talked to CSIS many, many times on a regular, sometimes daily basis, things that I'm seeing. And federal officials and departments, I think at what's known as ISAD, Innovation, Science and Economic Development, took it seriously. Global Affairs Canada did too, to an extent, but then their task is diplomacy as
Right.
opposed to, the risks involved. And Department of National Defense took it seriously. I 3 times briefed across governmental forum of officials focused who have some focus in their jobs on China, maybe 40, 45 people. And so I've briefed them a number of times. And so, I always have my public policy and government hat on, even though I retired, 13 years ago, 14 years.
You'll never retire, Margaret.
No,
That will never happen.
no. And it's also why I have my phone next to me at all times in case I need to respond to something. That doesn't leave you when you retire either. But anyway, because I knew a lot of people in government, I was taken seriously on this. They understood my research. I always showed them that the sources I was using. And I did a major study for 6 years on Canadian technology joint ventures in China and the risks that they've run into, the various tactics that the Chinese have used to take over the joint ventures and ease out the Canadian partner over time. Sometimes that Chinese partner will become the Canadians' competition internationally now that they have the IP from the Canadian company. So there have been really, really risky things that have happened with our small and very vulnerable SMEs, and particularly in clean energy and clean tech. So when I heard Minister Joly saying that we were going to have new joint ventures with China, especially in clean energy, I thought, they obviously haven't read my paper. And I must say, to their great credit, her office reached out to me, and I've done several briefings of them already, as well as briefings with senior officials in the department just in the last 2 months, to try to bring them up to speed with some of these things that they weren't aware of. The negotiations in China surrounding Prime Minister Carney's visit were undertaken in a cone of silence. And so there wasn't a lot of consultation with people who might have been able to raise red flags about what they should watch for and what they should make as verboten as part of the negotiations, and so they're playing catch up a little bit now.
Okay, I want to get into that later because I'm going to put a pin in that. But first, I want to go back to a little bit of the narrative. One of the big concerns, now, admittedly, I'm not inside government. You've been an ADM. I have to watch all this from the outside. But one of the, I think, the concerns as an outsider that I have watching how this government has operated, particularly in the last 10 years, is an increasing sense that it's getting siloed, right? The different ministries, the different approaches to government. There's not the level of communication across silos as there potentially should be. Is that something that someone like me should be concerned about, or am I just misreading this as an outsider?
There is a lot of cross consultation. I know from being inside it and now dealing with officials myself across departments. I mean, there's not as much as there should be. Certainly the Privy Council office, I spent 4 years there under Pierre Trudeau, then Mulroney, and Turner for 5 minutes. They make sure there's coordination, and then people in departments know who in the other departments is working on things, and they can learn from each other. So there is a lot of consultation across departments. It's just in these international negotiations where they don't want leaks, which seemed to be the case in this case. They had very few people who were involved in what was going on behind the scenes.
Interesting. Okay. Going to come back to that. First, I want to go back to, your history with this particular topic. Was there a specific moment when you went, "Uh-oh, my optimism has been shaken or misguided. This isn't going the way we were hoping to"? Was there like a specific moment in time or history when you went, "Ee"?
Um, you're saying now in terms of government policy?
No, in terms of sort of our Canada or the Western world's approach to dealing with China. Was there a moment when
Yeah,
was there a heel turn moment here?
yeah, it was a mounting concern as I was seeing more things as I've described with the military civilian fusion, as it's sometimes called, and what's going on in the Arctic. And I was doing more and more briefings, and everybody was really appreciative of all these briefings. But I was in China, in Shanghai, when the Michaels were taken, and my own locked suitcases in my hotel room were searched, and nothing taken, just searched. And was meeting with a Chinese executive, and I mentioned to him about these two Canadians who had been they call it detained, but they're actually kept in a metal chair with their wrists and ankles clamped, and really harsh questions screamed at them in Mandarin for 6 to 8 hours a day. They're not sitting in their hotel room and somebody comes by to chat once in a while. Anyway, I mentioned this to him and he said, "Oh, yes, Beijing has a list of 100 Canadians they can pick up at any time and interrogate." I hadn't heard about this list, and I was going to China every year. And I got back, and two other people told me about the list, including a journalist. And another person said that I might be on it because of my work on joint ventures. I don't think so. I think it's a list of the Canadians who are living in China who they could take. And that was the case for Michael Covery and Michael Spavor. So I got on the plane, and I thought to myself, and then over that Christmas, I was reading Kevin Garrett's book about his own detention. He was similarly detained and then put on trial in China, innocent Canadian. And I thought, it's people like me who have to speak out. And so that really made me go public. I had never done an interview in my life until January of 2019. I was always too nervous about doing interviews, and I might say the wrong thing, and also I had never I had always told myself when I was in government that I would never be one of those ADMs who retires and then writes op-eds in the Globe and Mail
Yeah.
telling the government what
Oops.
they should be doing. And
Oops.
here all of a sudden I was writing these vehement op-eds about why we shouldn't have Huawei.
Right, right, right. So let me the kidnapping of the two Michaels is a really interesting side note. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but like as more details have come out since they've been returned, there actually have been allegations that at least one of the Michaels was doing a kind of soft intelligence work, and that's probably why he was targeted. And in fact, I believe one of the Michaels is in fact suing the Canadian government, saying, "I got swept up in your drama." Do you have any insight into that, or I mean, I know we don't have really a spy service in Canada doing work on what's happening in other countries, but there are people like Canadians living all over the world who, will explain what they think is going on, and that can be interpreted as a kind of soft intelligence work. What's your
Um,
understanding of that situation?
I don't think it was soft intelligence that was going on, but the Michael Kovrig, in his work with the International Crisis Group, one of his jobs was to have contacts with people across China in environmental issues, human rights issues, those kinds of things. So the contacts that he had, I think, were what the Chinese were looking for, as opposed to intelligence per se. I think it was just the contacts. And what they do is they milk those people for the names and contacts of all of their contacts.
Right.
And then they go after those people in China who they can then throw in jail. And so it's a real risk when a Canadian is taken like that. In the case of Michael Spavor, he was right on the border with Korea and went there and met with senior people in Korea many times. That was his job, to lead groups to go into North Korea. And so I'm sure the Chinese were really interested in who he knew there and
Right.
what he knew from that, and what he thought of the leadership there. And so, and his Mandarin unfortunately wasn't very strong, and so he must have had a really bad time incarcerated like that for almost 3 years.
Yeah. Let's talk about why is it that the Chinese are so sensitive about the human rights and especially the forced labor issue? Obviously, we know they don't like it when other countries criticize them for this. We understand that it's something that Mark Carney has agreed not to discuss this in public necessarily. What is it? Why is there that sensitivity on the Chinese side?
There have been several episodes where different groups have they were small episodes by a lot of standards, but huge in the Chinese mind, or the Chinese leadership's view. One was Uyghur attacks, I think in 2014, no, earlier than that, early in the 2000s, where there was a sudden repression by the Chinese state of the culture of the Uyghurs. They were hoping to make them more like Han Chinese. And there was a big episode fighting back, and a lot of Han Chinese in Xinjiang were killed by a lot. I think it was, like 100. There was a separate case by Falun Gong, who are people who have, it's more kind of like a Zen personal exercise kind of group. It's not a religion, but they wanted to make a statement to the Chinese leadership at one point that they should be permitted to practice their exercises and so on widely in China. And so a large group of them in the thousands gathered in a semicircle outside the gates of Chongnan High, which is where the Chinese leadership live. And just their presence there, they just sat there silently. They didn't take any action. And ultimately they were dispersed, peacefully. But it terrified the leadership. So those two episodes were things that really galvanized the leadership to clamp down really hard. And we saw that similarly at the time of the Tiananmen massacre, where some members of the government were actually encouraging the students and workers who were in the square, and there were more than 1 million in the square at one time. People were gathering every evening. It was like a big street party in Tiananmen Square, until the government, like overnight, just decided to put an end to it violently. And so that remains unspoken now in China, but everybody knows about it. Not the young people, because the parents are trying to protect the young people and don't want the young people to say anything about Tiananmen, so they don't tell the young people about it. But they tend to find out slowly. And so, something similar happened with the Xidan democracy wall that I mentioned, which was in 1978-79, where Deng Xiaoping himself, in an interview with two journalists, including John Fraser of the Globe and Mail, said that he encouraged the students to be doing this, to be calling for democracy and having their voice heard by putting up big character posters along Chang'an Avenue near Xidan. And then all of a sudden, they arrested the leaders of the Xidan movement, Wei Jinsheng in particular, and others as well. And so, they allow these things to happen and lure the people in, and then all of a sudden block it violently and with the military. And so it's the Chinese are learning to be very cautious, and stability is the key priority for the Chinese government. They don't want anything that will cause an unstable government or unstable leadership, and they don't want a coup against Xi Jinping. So this is why a lot of the very senior leaders are being charged with corruption, because he thinks that maybe they'll try to depose him, and so he just finds a ruse to throw them in jail. So a lot of these corruption things aren't corruption at all. They're just sidelining the leadership.
The common through fare I hear when you talk about these various different examples is any kind of demonstration of an independent civic organization outside of the Chinese party. If there's any actual show of humans creating an organized civic society of some kind, whether it's Falun Gong or an actual overt democracy movement, the Uyghur Society would have been obviously a minority society within Han China, so of course they would have had their own kind of civic structure that was subnational. And what I'm hearing you say is that consistently over time you've had the Chinese leadership regard any form of this as a threat to their legitimacy in leadership.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. So I mean, I think it's safe to say that you've been on this file for many, many, many years now. You are an expert. You are very credibly an expert witness on these particular files. With that understanding, and I believe you had also mentioned you were sanctioned by China in 2024. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Right. That was kind of interesting. And in fact, it goes back a little bit further than that. When Michael Chong got sanctioned, he was sanctioned for leading in Parliament the effort to have Parliament vote unanimously that what was happening to the Uyghurs was a genocide. So he led that. And it was successful. There was a unanimous vote in favor, except Cabinet didn't attend, and so they didn't vote. Otherwise, it was unanimous. And so, as a punishment, Michael Chong was sanctioned. And I thought to myself, "Wow, what a cool thing! What do I have to do to get sanctioned?" and then kind of put that out of my mind until December 21st, 2024. A few days before that, the Canadian government had sanctioned some leaders as government officials in China who had led the repression of the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. And I was very supportive of those people being sanctioned. They really were the leadership, and they were dastardly people. And so that was a really good move on the part of the minister at that time. Then all of a sudden, a group of 20 of us were told that we were being sanctioned by the Chinese in retaliation for the Canadian government sanction. And that was different because in Canada, that was the first time people from civil society had ever been sanctioned, as opposed to a government official or, a parliamentarian. And in the U.S., there is a small group of about a dozen who have been sanctioned, and those tend to be people like the head of the Human Rights Watch, the China director of Human Rights Watch, people like that.
Real monsters.
Yeah, real monsters. And interestingly, and I haven't spoken about this in public before, but there are 7 of us who are dual citizens. So the Chinese didn't know that they were sanctioning people who had citizenship in other countries. So that was kind of interesting. So
can I ask what other country you're a citizen of, or is that too sensitive?
No, that's okay. It's the U.S.
The U.S. Okay.
Yeah. So actually, the RCMP and CSIS have briefed us on, what to do if something happens, if we're sanctioned. But I have my own FBI agent. And I have his cell phone number. I can just call him if any tiny little thing happens that I'm feeling uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what does being sanctioned mean exactly? Is it just a diplomatic thing, or does it
No,
mean that you are under threat? What does it mean?
It does matter. Number one, you can't visit China. I wouldn't visit China anyway because they kidnap innocent Canadians. So I'm not going back. Secondly, all my assets in China are frozen. That doesn't matter to me because I don't have any there. But other people do who were sanctioned. And then third, I can't communicate with or collaborate with people in China. And I have lots of friends there and former colleagues, people who I know well, including senior people in government. And I just can't talk to them. And that actually has become a problem in the context of what happened a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, well, let's get into that because that's a beautiful transition.
Do you have an advanced degree in technology and cybersecurity? Yes or no?
No, but I have spent 37 years in that business. I need to get short answers, please.
Okay. The other one is you belong to the China Strategic Risk Institute. So does this institute specifically look for risk when there isn't one? Yes or no?
No.
So why is it a risk institute?
Because it analyzes risks that are obviously there.
Thank you. So the last question then is, you claim about forced labor in Shenzhen. Have you witnessed this yourself? Have you been there ever?
I've been to China many times.
Have you witnessed
since
forced labor in
1979?
Have you witnessed just a short answer. Have you witnessed forced labor in Shenzhen? Yes or no? So did you get that from hearsay?
I work closely with Human Rights Watch where researchers did witness it.
So thank you.
So you're called to testify about Chinese EVs. I mean, I couldn't imagine someone who would be more valuable to speak at a parliamentary committee than someone who's been on this file for decades and focused on the technology file. I think that anyone who's watching it in good faith can see what he was attempting to do there. But can you tell me what was going through your mind when you realized that that attack was happening?
Well, I didn't see it so much as an attack. I saw it as a tactic. He was trying to undermine my credibility and get me to give answers that would embarrass myself and demonstrate that I don't know what I'm talking about. And he failed spectacularly at that. And then his tactic, according to his office, once he had dispensed with me, the tactic on paper, they said in a statement after the fact, was that he would then move on to the pro-China witness. And so that's what he did.
And this whole episode appeared in state media as well, I believe, did it not?
In China.
Yeah.
Yes, it did. And this is why I've got a problem. It's kind of interesting. It's got two dimensions. I'm not able to communicate with all the people who would have seen those reports. And it was widely spread across China that he's a zero and I'm basically, he's a hero and I'm basically a zero. And so I can't explain to my friends what actually happened in the committee. I can't send them the tape or anything because I'm not supposed to be talking to them. And I don't want to jeopardize their situation there. They're stuck there. And unless they can find a way to escape China, I'm not going to be able to talk to them about it. So that's too bad. But on the other hand, and just before this interview started, I got another one. I've been getting messages through various routes from grassroots people in China who somehow figured out how to get a message indirectly to me that I was absolutely right in what I was saying about forced labor. And the labor standards there are very, very poor. And they wanted me to know that they appreciated what I was saying and invited me to, if I could come. They recognized I couldn't because I was sanctioned, but if I ever could come in the future, they would give me all kinds of evidence about the forced labor there. And so these are the kinds of messages that I've been getting. And I've figured out, I think now, how I can communicate with them without the government being alerted to an email from me going to somebody over there. They have they talk in code. They have to use a different name than China or forced labor. So they have euphemisms, but then they explain why they have a particular euphemism. And so it's clear what they're doing. And because there's such a heavy censorship of the internet there. So that's been encouraging to me. Not everyone has seen me to be a zero as I've been portrayed by the state media there.
So this is really interesting. This gets us into the meat of the actual issue behind the issue. And that is, of course, Canada's in a really tricky geopolitical position. I think all of us can understand why Canada would want to strengthen connections with all of the powers on the table in order to maximize its ability to gain leverage and move in a new great power block kind of scenario. So like big picture, I think everybody gets it. Small picture, I think that Canadians need to be really clear-eyed about what a closer relationship with China means for us. And what we need to be watching out for. So can you talk to me a little bit about what you see the risk of more Chinese EVs into the Canadian marketplace will mean? Just so that people know, Mark Carney broke with the United States in imposing 100% EV tariffs on Chinese EVs recently. I think this was as much about freeing up canola and some Western agricultural exports as anything else, because China had counter-sanctioned, particularly some Western ag exports. So I know, for example, Western ag producers were very happy about this. Um, and I think that the proposal is something like 49,000 EVs. So representing a relatively small share of the market, but a significant share of market, as well as more collaboration with Canadian companies to help build those EVs. Particularly, I think as the Americans threaten our auto interreliance, more investment into the auto sector in Canada is a welcome thing. But of course, this is not a morally unfraught territory for us to be engaging in. So what are the risks of the EVs, and what do we know about forced labor into the materials of those EVs?
Right. And I have written a number of op-eds about why we shouldn't be having Chinese EVs come. And so I'll go into those, but just before I do, I was recommending that instead of EVs, we put something else on the table that they wanted even more, which is access to our conventional energy and investment in our conventional energy.
Well, Britta would love to hear that.
Well, yeah. And so put that on the table instead. But instead what they did is they gave them both. And I think, we're known in China as being poor negotiators, and I think that's what happened. Some will say, well, they insisted on having, EVs. Well, as I will describe, there are big problems with them. And so be prepared to walk away from the table if necessary. We will always have trade with China. They want our resources. We want their manufactured things. But we don't need to be tied so closely on sensitive technology areas. So there are a number of dimensions of the risks associated with EVs. One is the cyber risk and the software. Most of the Chinese EVs use Baidu software, and that software manages the cameras, the microphones, the GPS, and other electronics in the car. And so for each vehicle, you see where the people are going, what they're saying, who they're with, and so on. That can all be tracked. And it's important because China has shown malign intent towards us. And we will, at some point in the future, potentially see China as an adversary. And, them having complete access by the software to the images of all of our communities, all of our neighborhoods, all of our houses, in all of our cities, is a serious issue. Yes, it's only 3% of all auto sales in Canada, but it's 49,000 is 46% of our EV sales last year. 70,000, so it'll go up to 70,000 quickly per year. 70,000 is more than half of our EV sales last year. So, it's displacing EVs that normally would be sold in Canada. It's EVs that are safe. So the software is an issue. The aluminum in each of the vehicles, dozens of parts of each of the vehicles that are made of aluminum are made with Uyghur forced labor. And this has been documented by many organizations, including Human Rights Watch, that did a 2024 report that showed how it was tracked. And it's not just in Chinese brands. It's also in Teslas that are made in Shanghai, and Volkswagen, Toyota, and GM and Ford products that are made in other parts of China, that in joint ventures with Chinese companies. And this all happened, this joint ventures thing happened in 2015, when Xi Jinping said, from now on, if you're a foreign company in China, like Microsoft, for example, you have to sell more than 50% of your company to a Chinese partner or get out of China altogether. And so Microsoft sold for $1.5 billion and lost control of its China business. And that's happened to a lot of companies, including these auto companies. When asked about the aluminum, the Western companies say, we don't have operational control over the factory in China, and control over the supply chain, and so we can't control what's put into the cars, and they even say we won't raise the issue of the Uyghurs because the government officials are sensitive about that. And we don't want to disturb their sensibilities or their feelings. And one of the things that the Western firms in joint ventures fear, and it's happened to quite a number of joint ventures, is criminal charges against members, the officials of the Western company, the Western partner in a joint venture. And they don't want to go to jail. They've seen others go to jail. And the last thing they want to do is spend, 15 to 20 years in a Chinese prison. It's the conditions are terrible. And so they don't want that. They also don't want an exit ban. If there's something that's controversial in the joint venture that the Chinese want to put pressure on the Western partner, they'll just say that they're going to ban them from leaving the country until it's resolved. And so they're really afraid of that. It's one of the reasons why a lot of Western executives don't travel to China anymore, because their families put pressure on them, saying they don't want them to be, at risk like this. They've seen the example of the Michaels and so,
And not just the Michaels. There have been some other Canadian executives as
yeah,
well.
Yes, exactly.
I want to play devil's advocate on one thing. The forced labor around the aluminum supply chains, I think I think that's a well-documented thing. And I'm not an intelligence expert or security risk expert here. But if I want to play devil's advocate with the security risks presented by EVs, I would make an argument that said something to the effect of, well, look, do I want highly sensitive persons in politics or journalism or anything like that buying a Chinese EV? No, probably not. But for your average everyday Canadian who's, working a normal job, taking their kids to school, is that person really a security risk? My argument would probably be no. And then your argument, I think your well-argued point about the software, taking images of all of our roads and things like that. I think that's a fair point. But Google's already done all that, right? Like, are they going to be getting more information than I can get when I go into Google Maps and look at Street View? Doesn't sound like it. Doesn't sound like it, if we're being honest.
Well, that's why government departments, not just the military or CSIS, but government departments should ban them from, entering their parking lots, for example.
Oh yeah, okay.
Because you don't want the Chinese to know who from other countries or who from sensitive organizations are visiting a government department, like I said, on a regular basis or at particular times.
Sure.
And so you're right. Somebody driving their kid to school, maybe not an issue, but it gives them, that much more data that they can use. They're not necessarily going to use it next year, but they might use it 5 or 6 years or 10 years from now.
Yeah.
So I've suggested that we strip out the Baidu technology from the cars when they arrive and insert BlackBerry's QNX, which is what the North American cars use.
And that strikes me as a pretty reasonable compromise. And at the same time, I don't think that this represents the same kind of potential security risk as Huawei in the 5G networks in the same way? I mean, if you were to weight these relative risks, where
Well,
would you put those?
there's one other dimension, and that is the telecom dimension. Because well, telecom, it's the electricity grid. When they're plugged in, the U.S. Department of Energy has shown that there's a risk of if a surge is downloaded, like they adjust the software at night, like your phone is adjusted at night, and if they put a surge in, it could give you brownouts in cities and make the electricity grid unstable. In Norway, they bought a lot of buses from China and then found that China could just stop them on the street without notice. And so they got rid of those buses. Something similar can be done on the CRRC light rail trains in Boston, Montreal, and a few other cities. They banned them in Washington, D.C. because of the sensitivity of the microphones, picking up discussions about government policy on light rail. But I have a colleague in the U.S. government who visited Nanjing and the CRRC factory there and was shown by the CEO how he could open and close the doors of the Boston light rail system from Nanjing. So same kind of thing, same kind of remote control as the Norwegian buses. So that matters if they had a way to stop not just the buses, but the cars, if they wanted to bring our society to a halt kind of thing. We're talking here,
it's possible, but we're still in the realm of speculative.
Well, they aren't even here yet, and it's speculation, except we know the technology exists and we know that China can use it because they use it with those buses and with the CRRC Boston subway doors.
And I think there's, just from what you're saying, I don't want government officials buying Chinese EVs. I don't think that is a reasonable risk. I don't want people who are, even people like me who might be in a journalistic situation, who might be dealing with stuff that's sensitive. Right. I don't think I should be buying a Chinese EV. I don't think that would be a smart investment for me. The other question I want to ask you is, of course, we have the Americans responding to our closening ties to the Chinese, and I think that there's concerns that have been raised that I think are very reasonable. And then I see a lot of concerns coming out of, for lack of a better term, the MAGA sphere, that are trying to portray Canada as having been taken over by the Chinese communists, or effectively which I think is very much a bad faith attempt to delegitimize Canadian leadership. And that's how I read it.
Yeah.
But a lot of attempts to delegitimize governments are sometimes rooted, or delegitimize actors, are sometimes rooted in a little grain of truth. So can we find out, or can we talk about what here is truth and what here is bad faith exaggeration in terms of Canada's relationship with the Chinese? I know there's also been a long, really fascinating history with the Liberal Party leadership and Chinese communist leadership that spans decades beyond what I could probably get into. But where does the grain of truth exist, and what is the reality from your perspective?
Well, we find more and more about it every day, but I think the kind of basic view that I have is that, for the most part, people who espouse closer relations with China and who advocate for Chinese technologies and so on, they don't do it because they're being given a script by the CCP. I think they may do it because they know that it will be warmly received by people who work in the Chinese embassy here. They may think that this is a way to win friends there, and they look forward to more trips and things like that. However, I don't think they have any nefarious things for the most part. but the Chinese embassy and consulates work through Chinese Canadian business people in elections. And we saw that in the Hague Commission, that it found a lot of serious problems in the way that elections were funded and how candidates were supported through free labor on their campaigns by Chinese businesses that would lend their staff, specially hired staff, to work on the campaign. So things like that are not on. So the government has to be much more vigilant about that. So that's more overt and unwelcome.
And I just want to put a pin in there just so we're not adding to the disinformation, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the Hague Commission is that there was evidence of attempted electoral interference by Chinese state actors and Chinese affiliated state actors through the mechanisms that you're describing, but there wasn't evidence to show, and also I believe things like group chats that had spread disinformation about particular WeChats and things like that. But however, there wasn't enough, even though there was evidence of their attempts, the attempts were not substantive enough to have materially overturned the results of any election that we can see to date. And I think even the former leader Aaron O'Toole came out publicly and said that was probably that was the case according to the evidence that he had. Now, is that your interpretation?
I think there were probably several ridings that were swung because of those efforts. The overall elections went ahead, and it didn't determine if one party took over versus another party took over.
So that's, I mean, there was probably evidence of a handful of ridings. Yeah, I think there were especially two or three being swung.
What that does is it takes out from Parliament those particular individuals who are critics of China. And you just have to take out 3 or 4 or 5 of those people, and you change the tone of Parliament when it comes to issues of China.
Well, and that brings us back to the original conversation that we're now dealing with Michael Ma, because we know that Michael Ma was a floor crosser from the Conservatives to the Liberals. So it doesn't, as I said, is there evidence that like 40 MPs are in the pocket of China? No, but if you can make a difference in terms of a handful of ridings, especially when we're dealing with a very narrow majority, that can actually materially influence politics. And that's where we come back to the original conversation that you had with Mr. Michael Ma in the committee room.
Right. And I don't think the candidates themselves know what's going on, because a lot of this is surreptitious. It really is under the radar. And that's why it was so hard to get it out in the Hague Commission investigations. But in the case of Mr. Ma, I think, he isn't in the back pocket of the Communist Party. He I think, thought that this would be helpful to Canadian government policy, which is in favor of Chinese EVs, and would be supported by the Chinese embassy officials that he sees from time to time, or the consulate.
So you don't think that the Michael Ma situation is literally Michael Ma as a spy for Beijing?
No,
you think that it's more
all.
complicated than that?
No.
Okay.
I think former Canadian Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques said that in his view, Mr. Ma is what the Chinese call, and I don't like to say this about an individual myself, but the words are a useful idiot. That's the expression. And it's a long-standing Chinese term that means somebody who will help us because they're naive and don't know how they're being used. Right. And don't know enough to do anything else. I have an alternative view of what's happened with Mr. Ma that I haven't heard from anybody else. It relates to a question that I was asked in the International Trade Committee, parliamentary committee. Are Chinese EVs a Trojan horse? And I said, yes, actually they are, for the cybersecurity reasons and so on. And it got me thinking about maybe the Conservatives actually sent Mr. Ma over to the Liberals as a Trojan horse to explode when the Liberals were least expecting it. Because that's in effect what happened. His thing went so badly that what he was trying to do just backfired so royally that it looked like something that maybe the Conservatives.
Now, to be fair, that is giving the Conservatives a lot of credit. I'm not sure if that credit is well due. Look, Margaret, we've been chatting for an hour, but I really have just one final question for you. Like I said, I think that both Matt and myself at the line is that we try not to be naive about China, but we try not to be naive about the Americans either.
Yes.
So the question is, we're in a pickle. We're in a real pickle geopolitically. And the only way I think that we are going to optimize the pickle that we're in is if we are very, very savvy, very, very well informed, and very, very canny. Is Canada sophisticated enough, in your opinion, to navigate a relationship with the Chinese in the current environment?
I think we can be. I think we need to be more savvy than we were, back in January when this deal was done. What the Chinese learned from that experience is that canola works. Canola is their leverage, and the canola part of the deal that was signed or agreed to only goes to the end of this calendar year. And so that's that specter of, the poor canola farmers being held hostage again is hanging there. So when
and hanging there just in the midst of a rising separatism concern in Alberta as well.
Right.
Not that canola, right. I think that actually canola is some of the other problems, but it goes into longstanding grievances that Western farmers have.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, they need to be diversifying, but even more importantly, the Canadian government needs to help them diversify, because right now our public policy is held up. It's at the whim of the Chinese. Right now, the Chinese want our help so they can join CPTPP, the Pacific Trade Agreement. And both China and Taiwan are applying. And if we support Taiwan and not China, our canola farmers are going to feel it. So it's the third time they've used canola, and this should be the number one priority of the Canadian government, to protect our canola farmers and get them new markets. Because
and pork too, as I would also add to that list as well.
Seafood, yeah.
And seafood, yeah. But I mean, this is an interesting conversation, because I mean, I've had the opportunity to talk to some farmers conferences and various things. I mean, one of the great things about being in Calgary is like you can develop some relationships with the ag industry. And I can tell you, a few years ago, I remember having a really interesting chat with them, and I was at a panel discussion saying, you guys can't trust China. You need to be diversifying away from China. And let me tell you, that room went real quiet. Went real quiet. So, a lot of this has to do with internal domestic politics, and I think even a lot of domestic political watchers realize. So, there was, and I tell you, when the 100% EV tariff came down in line with the American tariff, there are a lot of very angry Western farmers calling into the CBC, very, very upset, because of course China counter-tariffed canola, and they said, you guys are saving Eastern auto plant manufacturers and you're hanging us out to dry. You once again, Ottawa is willing to bankrupt me and my farm in order to go preserve Dougie's auto pact.
Right.
And that was very much the sentiment. I think now, especially as we're heading into a separatism threat, that makes that particular relationship all the more sensitive, right?
Yeah, that will be absolutely. But I feel for the farmers, that's for sure. It's they just happen to be the ones that the Chinese use. What they use is crops or products that they have alternatives for. And
Right.
they have their own canola, they have their own seafood, and in fact, they have huge fleets, fishing fleets out all the time. So they have other sources. Our seafood is the best, of course. They have a massive pork industry in China, so they can always, make do for a number of months or a year to put the pressure on Canada. They've now got Australia as a source for canola. And so we're in a really difficult place. But I'm very supportive of the Prime Minister's efforts to diversify our trade. And I think, we need to be doing more of that.
Yeah. Margaret, I've really appreciated this conversation. I feel like we have just gone through decades worth of rich material in a really accessible way, and I think there's going to be a lot of listeners out there who really appreciate your time. Also really appreciate the work that you're doing on this file. It's never fun to be attacked at committee for partisan reasons or partisan gain, but I think you handled it as well as possible, and it's lovely to have had the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Well, good to talk to you too, Jen. And you clearly have done a lot of stories in the past on China because you're very well informed.
No, I haven't done very many stories in the past at all. I haven't done barely nothing on China, but hey, if more stories come my way, I'll do my best. So again, thank you so much for your time, and check us out, www.readtheline.ca. If you haven't already, do like and subscribe.